Greetings, Internet. In this video, I'm going to cover the basic layout of the Unity game editor. Now, Unity is a very powerful tool, but like any tool, it's got a lot of options and a lot of settings, and it's a good idea to have a general knowledge of where you go to accomplish certain tasks. So, to begin with, let's go over the menu bar at the top. Under File, we have our standard assortment of file operations: new, open, save. Probably our most important option under this one is our build settings. Build settings is where you go to set your target platform and set some basic settings on it, such as target, Windows, Mac, Linux, architecture. Is this a development build? Marking something as a development build allows you to do script debugging on that development build, so that can be quite important. It also has a direct link to player settings where you can set more options. You also set which scenes you're going to use in your build here. So moving on from there, under Edit, we've got our standard edit operations. In addition to, we've got Preferences, which are the editor preferences. These preferences have nothing to do with the game itself. Some general preferences here. Probably the most important one under Preferences are our external tools and setting our external script editor. So by default, Unity is going to want to use MonoDevelop. Now, MonoDevelop is an OK editor, and in fact, you will have to use MonoDevelop in order to do break-in debugging. But for general coding work, I do prefer to use Visual Studio because the autocomplete on Visual Studio is much better. Whether you're using the full version or the express version, doesn't matter. It'll still work just as fine. This is also where you can set your Android SDK location if you are worried about developing for that. You can also set your colors, key shortcuts, and the cache server, which is only available if you have the appropriate expensive license. Moving on from there, we have got selections, both loading and saving selections. Selections are useful when you've got a group of objects in a scene that you might want to edit all at once. Say you're doing an indoor scene and you've got 40 different lights scattered throughout the scene, but they're all supposed to be the same light like you see in a building. It'd be useful to have all of those lights under selection, load the selection, and make all your changes at once. Moving on down, we have project settings, which gives us a variety of settings that we can use for the project, like input, tags, which are really important, some player information, physics. And by player, it's referring to the target platform. This is the same menu that you get from going to your build settings and clicking on player settings. This does not mean the player as in the character that the player is controlling. You also have render settings, where you can go to set your clear color and skybox material, among some other settings. Network and graphics emulation for testing different conditions. So if you're doing an online game, you might want to test what happens if the connection's only as good as dial-up. Do things still work? Graphics emulation. What happens if you try to run with only Shader Model 1 available? Will your game still run? Is the performance acceptable? And finally, snap settings for setting how big the snap is or how small the snap is when dragging things around in the editor with snap turned on. Moving on from there, we have our assets, which are the resources we have available to create our games with. You can create a new asset. You can import an entire package, export a package, and resync your project. Moving on to game object, we can create an empty game object, which those are so useful. Never underestimate the usefulness of empty game objects for Unity. Of course, we'll talk more about those in great detail later. Of course, we can create some of the default prefabs that are available to us, and we have some different selection options here that are enabled once you actually have objects selected. We have our components menu, where we can select various components to add into a game object. As you add additional packages and write scripts, the components that are available to you here will change. Terrain is for creating 3D terrains. Of course, once you do create terrain, it'll create and set up the terrain in the current scene, And then you've got a variety of options that are available to you once you have an actual terrain selected. Window is where you can control your layout and also enables you to open up specific windows. Now, most of these windows are available by right-clicking on the tabs, which we'll see in a moment. Some of them are not. And also notice that we have a few grayed out: Profiler, Asset Server, Occlusion Culling, Navigation. Those are only available to the Pro version of Unity. And so I can't, it won't even let me bring those windows up since I can't use them. Now, the layout is rather interesting. Unity uses a tearable layout. And by that, I mean you can grab any one of these tabs here, click and drag, and tear that particular window. You can either tear it out to make it a free-floating selection, or you can move it around to different areas. So I could move my scene over here, or I could move it over here. Oops, and I just got it off track completely, which, not to worry, I can come over here and reselect my default layout and reset everything. But what I was trying to do was this right here. I can change how much space particular windows have, so on and so forth. It's a very flexible, very customizable interface when you're allowed to tear these things around. A particularly useful trick if you have multiple monitors, which obviously doesn't show up really good on a video like this, is you can tear something off like the console into a free-floating window and drag that window off onto the second monitor, so that way you free up some more space. Now, there are some defaults set, which you can access either by going to this button here or by going to Window and selecting Layouts. Now, you've got 2x3, a 4 split, which is useful for editing because it gives you 3 orthographic views plus a perspective view. You've got your default, a tall screen, or a wide screen. Now, you can set custom layouts as well. So, if I wanted my hierarchy there and my projects there, which that would actually be quite horrible. And let's say, if I right-click, as I mentioned before, if I right-click on these tabs, I can add a tab. So there's nothing that says I can't have 2 scene tabs going. You can have as many tabs as you want. Keep in mind, each tab does take resources, so at some point it starts becoming a little bit silly having too many tabs open. Now, once you get your layout customized the way you like it, you can go to Layouts and do a Save Layout and save the layout that you just customized. And I have one from earlier that I can load up, and here we've got this custom layout, which is really actually kind of horrible. So let's go back to default. Now, if you are working in the Johnson County Community College computer labs, don't worry about saving your layout because the computers are frozen with some special software that resets the computers every night. So when you come back in the next day, everything's going to be back to the default. So just be aware of that if you're at the JCC computer labs. All right. This top toolbar here, which you cannot customize, has some important things on it. You have your selection tools, or which tools you're going to be using in the scene edit. You've got center versus pivot for models, local versus global, and of course, all of this I'll be covering in different videos in more detail. You've got your preview game button, which will start the game running. While it's running, you can pause it, and then you can use this one to advance it frame by frame. Advancing things frame by frame can be very useful when you're trying to track down a particularly stubborn bug. Moving on down here, the hierarchy menu shows you all of the current game objects that are in the current scene. Now, a quick thing about terms and definitions, since I've used these a couple of times. A scene is, you can sort of think of that as a level, sort of. A scene is a collection of game objects that allows the user to do something. So a typical organization might be having a scene for the main menu, a scene for level 1, a scene for level 2, maybe a scene for showing off the end credits, things like that. And that's what you use scenes for. If you have experience with the Yo-Yo Games Game Maker program, rooms are basically the same thing as scenes. A game object is something that is placed inside a scene that can do something, whether it's render a model, receive player input, affect physics, things like that. By default, the only thing you have in your hierarchy is a main camera, which you must always have a camera in your scene in order to actually see what's going on. So the hierarchy lists all of the items, all of the objects that are currently in your scene. As you add things, say I add in a cube, it will be listed over here in the hierarchy. The Project tab, jumping down here towards the bottom, shows you all of the possible resources that you can add in to a scene. The things that are in your project folders aren't necessarily in your game, they're just available to be used. And this one, I don't really have anything all that interesting. I've got a bunch of scripts, and that's about it. But if I had more, if I had loaded in one of the asset packages, I might have things like character controllers or water that I can add in, or rocks or different meshes, things like that. So the projects are what you have available to use, but they're not necessarily in the game. Moving on over here to the right-hand side, we have the inspector window. Now, the inspector shows you what information about whatever is selected, whether it be an item in the hierarchy or something inside of your assets. So if you select a code file, it will show you information. It'll show you actually a preview about that particular code file. If I select something else like a scene, well, there's not much information to be shown on that. If I had models in here, I'd see model information. And if I was looking at a texture, I would see texture information. And likewise, when you select things, hierarchies, things in the hierarchy, it shows you your inspector information, transform, cube, box collider, mesh renderer. And then when I switch over to the main camera, we still have a transform, but then I've got different options being shown. Okay, moving on, we have got a scene view and a game view. The scene view is where you do your editing. This is where you grab and place your objects and rotate them and scale them and otherwise abuse and manipulate them. Your game window, while you're not running the game, is going to show you the very first frame that's going to be rendered. So wherever your camera happens to be looking, it's going to show you the very, very first frame. Now, the game window will not show GUI elements until you've actually started running it, which I don't have any GUI elements added onto this, but once I hit the run button, oh right, forgot this one has the BSP split code to it. So once you run it, you can see now that it looks completely different from what the preview is showing. Once you run it, then you'll actually be able to see your GUI elements and interact with the game. The final window that you'll most commonly deal with is the console. And this is where any error messages are going to come. Also, if you've got debug statements using the print statement from the game object class, or just manually hooking into the Unity debugger to print stuff here, you'll see information here. Also, any warnings or errors are written here as well. Now, Unity by default will not stop on an error. Instead, it'll just simply abort the script that gave the error. If instead you would like Unity to stop on an error, you can turn on error pause right here, and that way whenever Unity encounters an error in a script, it will stop instead of continuing execution. Now, there's one final window to take a look at, but I'm going to leave that window for its own video because it's really important. And that, if I can get my mouse under control, is the Asset Store. The Asset Store is a critical part of Unity. This is where you can go to get a very wide range of free and for pay services, models, textures, sounds, you name it. If it's game related, you can probably get it on the Asset Store. And if it's not there, hey, write it. Anybody can put stuff up on the Asset Store and try to earn some money off of that. But that one definitely deserves its own video. And so with that, that covers the basic layout of the Unity game engine. And so until the next video.